Thank you, John. Let me just clarify. I'm no longer working for the Chicago Tribune. That was many years ago. But it is in my bio, and thank you for mentioning it. Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Marda Dunsky. Muammar Gaddafi presided over Libya from 1969 to 2011, the longest period of rule of any post-colonial Arab leader. During these 42 years, Gaddafi bestowed upon himself the titles of such as guide and brother leader. He steered a ship of state that deprived its citizens of basic civil and human rights, while at the same time he asserted that his people were in control of their own country and destiny. Beyond the borders of Libya, Gaddafi fomented upheaval in neighboring African states and sponsored acts of terrorism. The most notorious of these was the bombing of Pan Am Flight 103 over Lockerbie, Scotland in December 1988, which claimed the lives of 270 people, including 189 Americans. Gaddafi succeeded in rehabilitating himself with the West at the turn of the 21st century by making reparations to the Lockerbie families and by halting his weapons of mass destruction program in 2003. During his 4-decade rule, he also raised the standards of living, literacy, and life expectancy of his people, using oil revenues that allowed him to avoid the perils of foreign debt. Nonetheless, with the Arab Spring revolutions already underway in neighboring Tunisia and Egypt, in mid-February 2011, Libya exploded in its own revolutionary fervor. 8 months later, in October 2011, assisted by a NATO air bombing campaign and a supply of ground weapons provided by the Gulf state of Qatar, the rebels had taken control of Libya and then executed Gaddafi, opening a new chapter in Libyan history. During those 8 months of revolution, Lindsey Hilsum, international editor for Britain's Channel 4 News, made 4 reporting trips to Libya, leading her to write the book that we are here to discuss today, Sandstorm, Libya in the Time of Revolution. Ms. Hilsum is familiar to American audiences through her appearances on the PBS NewsHour, CNN, and NBC. She has covered the major conflicts of the past 2 decades, including the wars in Iraq, Kosovo, and Afghanistan, as well as the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the genocide in Rwanda. In 2011, she reported from Egypt and Bahrain, as well as from Libya. Her journalism has won several prizes, including an Emmy and recognition from Amnesty International. Please join me in welcoming journalist and author Lindsey Hilsum. Okay, now we can chat. Lindsey, let's start out by you telling us about your reporting trips to the region last year. Tell us about how you were able to navigate the country, how sources cooperated with you or didn't, and about the general mood of the people as you observed and interacted with them. I just would like to add that in addition to providing a compelling narrative of the history of modern Libya and how the revolution unfolded, what Lindsey has done in the book is to weave in profiles of Libyans, both who had been in the country all along and some who returned to Libya during the revolution, to help us better understand how the events of the 4 decades and the revolution itself had an impact on ordinary people.
Okay, thank you very much, Marda, and thank you all very much for coming here. Chicago is an amazing place. I've never been here before, and I have to say it does feel like a very long way from Tripoli. But last year, the Arab Spring, I guess that was the year I went into journalism for. It was the most extraordinary time. It was a time when History was happening all around us. We still don't know how that history is going to end up. This is a story which has only just started. But I've been covering the Middle East. Marda is also someone very familiar with the region for about 20 years. And I think we all knew, though, this incredible pressure, as it was a powder keg. But none of us knew when or how the lid would come off. And then suddenly, with the suicide of a vegetable seller in Tunisia, in a small town in Tunisia, boom, that was what did it. Tunisia went, Egypt went, and then Libya. And I was interested in all of it. I spent a long time. I spent quite a while in Egypt. When Egypt was over in 18 days, I also went to Bahrain. But Libya was the only true revolution, because in the other places, Tunisia, I think, Ben Ali, the leader, it was as if he'd hijacked the state for a while, and then he was cast aside, and now they're back to normal. In Egypt, it was really more like a military coup, and we're seeing that now, that the structures of power haven't changed that much in Egypt. But in Libya, everything was thrown up in the air. Gaddafi was like the spider at the center of the web, and the revolution cut the web away, and then there was nothing. So it's year zero in Libya now. Let me go back to how I got in and so on. I mean, I had been in Egypt, and then we went over the border to Libya. I say we because I'm normally a television reporter, so I was with producer and camera person. And as we went through, we saw on the walls of the border post a big sign in English. Somebody had scribbled on in graffiti. It just said, "Welcome to free Libya." And there was a young man there who was perfect. He looked just like Rambo. He had long black hair. He had a bandana. He had a bandolero of bullets around him. And he seemed to be our guide. Okay, whatever. And so then we drove up to Tobruk, which is the easternmost city. And there we linked up with a young guy called Tawfiq. And he's one of the people whose stories I tell here, because Tawfiq has a particular role in the Libyan revolution, which was that at the beginning, one of the things that they did in the eastern countries was that they destroyed the statues of the Green Book. The Green Book was Gaddafi's barking mad philosophy. And they used to have statues, really ugly concrete statues painted green. How can you have a statue of a book? It's just like a little block. Anyway, that was what they had there. And so to destroy them with pickaxes and hammers, that was an incredible symbol. And what Tawfiq did was he filmed his friends doing that. He then locked himself inside the internet cafe. There was just one in Tobruk for 11 hours. The line went up and down. And eventually the line was cut, and it was cut for the next 6 months. But by then he'd done what he needed to do. He'd put up these pictures on his Facebook page, and he'd also put up his name and phone number. And he said, if anybody is interested in revolution in Libya, call me on this number. Now, that was very brave. That was very brave. His father had spent quite a lot of time in prison for opposing Gaddafi. And he went and he told his father what he'd done. And his father sort of said, God, how can you do that? And he said, if you ride the camel, you can't keep your head down. So they rode the camel. And in fact, Gaddafi's forces gave up, and his regime fell very, very quickly in the east. And our experience was incredibly positive. Libya had been closed. It wasn't North Korea, but not far off. It was very difficult to get in as a journalist. And those journalists who did go in tend to go in to interview Gaddafi. And ordinary people were not allowed to speak to foreigners. And so people were desperate to talk to us. They loved having us there. And people wanted to give us free accommodation. It took a long time to persuade the driver we found that we should pay for his services, because he said, no, this is what I want to do. And one of the inspirations for Sandstorm were the stories that people told, because people were telling their stories for the first time. 4 decades of not being able to trust anyone outside the immediate family. 4 decades of when relatives were locked up, were murdered, people were forced into exile. Nobody had been able to tell these stories. And then as the revolution wore on, people did incredible things, sort of feats of civil disobedience and the fighting and so on. And so that was really why I wanted to write the book.